All right, for the second video, we're going to start with feminist and gender studies. Um, Again, these overlap often with psychoanalytical studies and critical studies, Marxist studies, so they're not always in their own little silos, but we're going to look at them independently today. Feminist scholars, as you would expect, are interested in female characters, how they're treated, how are they, you know, how free are they to act? Are they oppressed? That sort of thing. Um, Gender studies goes beyond just female roles and looks at the roles of all genders. So in Kate Japan's Story of an Hour, we can obviously look at the two female characters. Louise Mallard is the primary character, but her sister appears as well, and look at how she's treated because of her gender. She's considered weak and frail and this sort of thing. And in the painting, we can look at it from a feminist perspective and how are the women dressed? What does that do to their freedom of movement? What is expected of women? It looks like a lot of issues of vanity are going on here, right? So those are the sorts of things we'd look at in terms of gender roles and feminism in specifically in the painting. Psychological examinations of works of art we often associate with Sigmund Freud. There are other theorists like Maslow, who's interested in self-actualization, how does a person become whole, and Jung, who looks at the archetypes of the subconscious, and we'll look at him later when we look at archetypal theory, so we won't look at him at the moment. So we'll just concentrate on Freud. We could look at the story of Kate Chopin, Story of an Hour, and try to identify which of the characters represents the id, which of the characters represents the ego and the superego. We could look at Louise Mallard as if we were doing a psychoanalysis session with her. What is she repressing anything? Is she recovering from some kind of neuroses? Is she delusional? Right? We could use all these psychological terms to try and understand her mental state. And we can look at the painting and do something similar. Who are these people? What do they represent psychologically? Are these all different aspects of Velázquez himself, right? Does the canvas represent his unconscious? Those sorts of things that we can play around with and do an analysis of the painting from a psychological perspective. Genre studies is pretty interesting. We know that Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour is a short story. Genre can refer to the type of story something is, like, or type of work. Is it a poem? Is it a novel? Is it a movie? Right? Those are all genres of text. We can also look at genres based on kind of what we'd see in a bookstore, right? You have different categories of books. So if you go to a bookstore, you might go straight to the horror books or the mystery section or the fantasy or the science fiction, right? Under science fiction, science fiction and fantasy is usually together in the store. So you might look at science fiction or fantasy. At fantasy, you might look at high fantasy or urban fantasy, or, right? There's all these different categories, and they all have their own characteristics. So we could do a study of Story of an Hour and decide what kind of story is it. Is it a mystery? Is there something really, is there a mystery going on here? One of my students once suggested that Louise Mallard, who dies at the end, she has a heart attack after her husband, who has supposedly been killed, walks through the door. And the girl argued that Louise's sister was having an affair with Louise's husband, and they actually planned this as a way to, taking into account her bad heart, of killing her so they could have each other and Louise's money. Something silly like that. But it worked. We could look at the work from a lot of genre perspectives, and what does that tell us about what the author's intentions might have been for that story. If we looked at Diego Velázquez's painting here, we can say this is a court painting. That's a genre of painting where members of the court are given their portraits. And we could compare it to other paintings of the same type and talk about what they have in common and what's different. So we could decide what kind of genre this painting is and make an evaluation or a comparison based on what we're seeing in the painting in terms of how well it fits that genre. So that's what genre studies is all about. Our final one is archetypal and mythological studies, where, again, we mentioned Carl Jung a moment ago. He believed that there are symbols and archetypes, which are sort of like the primary building blocks of ideas that all cultures share, but that each culture represents them differently. My example I give here is that every culture has a representation of death, the figure of death. For example, in most of Western culture, we have the character known as the Grim Reaper, right? We see him as a cloaked figure who comes with a big scythe and cuts people down, right? That's a very old figure. Cultures in Asia and Africa and the Middle East also have a figure of death, but it's not going to look the same, right? So he argues, Jung does, that we all share the same ideas, the same building blocks of ideas, but we represent them differently. These themes appear in myth, they appear in our literature. For example, in fairy tales, they have certain ideas that always appear, although they show up differently. For example, there's the wise old man, or the fairy godmother, or the magic flute, or the dark forest, right? There's all these little ideas that are called archetypes. We could look at the story of the hour and see if there's any archetypes in there that remind us of fairy tales or mythological studies. We could do the same thing in this painting. Is this painting based on, and I don't see it really, you'd have to kind of stretch it, I think, to make it work in Las Meninas. But a lot of paintings represent, and you've seen this in the Renaissance and already in the Baroque paintings, represent scenes from mythology, right? Scenes from great literature. So we could examine those paintings and see how they treat those stories. So basically our idea is to look at art, music, and literature from a lot of different perspectives, which will gain us a lot more, give us a lot more insights into the works themselves.